it's that lovely time of year again when booktubers come out and talk about their favorite books of 2022. Thank you for coming to hang out with me today on my channel, Frank Fiction. I'm Alex, and I have a list for you today of my top reads of 2022. The way that I organized these was by author, because I read multiple books by some authors and only one by others, so instead of bouncing back and forth between them, I just decided to lump them all together to make the list easier to follow along with. So the very first book that I have is by an author who has been a favorite of mine for several years. I have loved pretty much everything that she's written, and that author is Becky Chambers. And I pre-ordered this book, and it is A Prayer for the Crowned Shy, which is a monk and robot book, and is also the sequel to another novella called A Psalm for the Wild Built. And the main thing that I want you to know about these stories, and really about Becky Chambers in general, is her writing is very feel-good. They're stories that are meant to uplift you while also talking about some really difficult topics. So some of the questions that we talk about and try to answer in these stories are things like, is it okay to not always be a productive member of society? Is it okay to feel burnt out or have a desire for change? And the ultimate question that our robot Moscap is trying to answer to take back to the other robots in its community is, what do humans need? One of the really great things about this story is that now Moscap and Dex are traveling around to other towns where Moscap is meeting other humans besides Dex for the very first time. And in doing so, it starts to understand that humans are quite complicated, because answering the question, what do humans need? Well, that's not so easy, because every human might need something a little bit different. And not only that, but there are different kinds of needs. You have tangible needs and intangible needs. A tangible need, for example, might be the need for food or for shelter. And then once that has been received, people often then look for intangible things, such as the need for companionship or love, the need to be a part of their community or to feel like they're a part of something. And so these desires that people have are not things that robots really understand, because robots don't crave companionship or don't, crave food the way that humans do. Moscap starts to feel quite dejected in this story, because it realizes not only that it might not be able to answer its question, but also that its question might not be a good one. What do you do if the thing that you've sought the answer to is actually just a bad question in general? It reminds me that I don't always have to be productive, and even when I'm not really feeling like I'm accomplishing all that much, that I'm still a worthy member of society too. And I really appreciate that. So, brief synopsis for a brief story, but I would highly recommend that you pick up A Psalm for the Wild Built and A Prayer for the Crowned Shy. Up next, I have a book by another all-time favorite author of mine, and that author is Terry Pratchett, and the book is Weird Sisters. And Terry Pratchett, for those of you who have never read his work, is very well known for his puns and his sense of humor and his sharp wit, but above all, he's just an unrivaled master of satire. There is no one, in my opinion, that I have ever come across who is able to compete with Terry Pratchett. And unfortunately, Terry Pratchett is no longer with us. He passed away some years ago from Alzheimer's. But before he passed away, he left us 41 books in the Discworld series, and Weird Sisters is the 6th one. And I am determined to read them in chronological order, because all of them are just so good, and I like to read them as he wrote them. So each one of his books focuses on a different issue in society. So in this case, Terry Pratchett is talking about how storytelling shapes our perception of reality, and how there are some people who will use language to manipulate others into believing that their possibly nefarious deeds are actually good ones, aka politics. I also really love how the title itself is a pun, because it's in reference to the Fates, and that ties into the main plot of this book, because witches and magic users in general in the Discworld do not rule any kingdoms, and the reason for that is because it is generally believed that magic is meant to be ruled and is not meant for ruling. So witches do not involve themselves in the fate of royals, but in this story there is an evil duke who murdered the prior king, and he is determined to ruin these witches' reputation and turn all of the villagers against them. So in order to maintain their way of life, they now have to get involved in a way that they normally wouldn't, and that's kind of what kicks off the plot. He frames it, of course, in a very comedic way, and there are hijinks like time traveling an entire town, and he gives us 3 witchy ladies who are all very different and who don't always get along but have to come together in order to solve the main issue. And it's just really fun, and I enjoyed this immensely, and I would highly recommend, if you've never picked up a Discworld novel, that you start with the very beginning and maybe come on this journey with me. And up next, I have a book that is on the complete opposite end of the spectrum of cozy or humorous, which is a horror novel, Under the Dome by Stephen King. And this is my 16th novel that I've read from Stephen King, so I'm very well acquainted with his work, and I can honestly tell you that this is one of my favorite books that I have ever read of his. So the plot of this story starts with the town of Chester's Mill, which is a small American town that is completely made up. Most of Stephen King's novels take place in towns that don't actually exist. It was an ordinary town until one day it became really interesting when a dome slams down around the town, and it made it to where no one can get in and no one can get out. And there is a local politician who is the second selectman, Big Jim Rennie, who sees this as his opportunity to become the dictator, the tyrant of the town, and basically rule with an iron fist. And so he ends up getting the police force involved to keep everyone in line, and he starts coming after one of our main characters, Dale Barbera, to try to get him out of the way so that he can rule in absolution. And then we have our other main character, Julia Shumway, who is the local newspaper editor, and together her and Dale Barbera have to go find out perhaps where the dome came from and possibly whether they can get it to go away. And I love this novel because despite its immense size, it is incredibly fast-paced. There's always something going on in this story. And I usually like to read the acknowledgments anymore in the back of books because it kind of gives an insight into what either the author was trying to accomplish or what they believe about their own writing. One of the things that Stephen King mentioned is that he wanted this story to never let off of the gas, and he accomplished that. I will also say that he created I won't say a character map in the beginning because it doesn't show how the characters are related to one another, but he gives the list of the most important characters in Chester's Mill, and you can see that he kind of groups them together in terms of like town kids and medical staff and the police force and dogs of note. It's a lot of people, and I was really grateful that he did that because I'm not somebody who's particularly great with names, so this was great for me, and I referenced it quite often. We move very fluidly between pretty much all of these characters. If they get a spotlight in this book, it's because they're doing something. They are going to complete a task, and when their task is over, we are moving right along to the next character. I also think that he handles suspense exceptionally well in this story because we get the third person omniscient perspective because we're in pretty much all of the characters' heads. We are privy not only to the small town politics that they know is going on, but also the main lead up in the story is that there's supposed to be this really huge disaster that no one knows what it is or why it's going to happen, but we do. The main characters think that like, oh, it's the local politics that's the big problem, and really there's something much bigger that's coming down the pipeline. And I honestly would encourage you to read this story if you're a fan of horror or even small town politics, because that part of this story was great. I would encourage you to pick this up. I will give trigger warnings though, because if you're a very empathetic person like me, there are things in this book that will hurt you. So for example, there's violent rape. There's of course the police brutality that I mentioned. There's suicide. There are many animal deaths, including the deaths of pet dogs, which was really heartbreaking for me because I have 2 dogs that I love very much and they're my whole world. So just a warning for that, but it is Stephen King. So if you've ever read anything from him, you kind of already know what you're getting into. Up next, I have Douglas Adams, who was the writer of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and The Restaurant at the End of the World, which of course these are only the first 2 books in the series of 5. I have the other 3, I just haven't gotten to them yet. And then another book I read from him this year, which I don't have a copy of because I got it from the library, so I'll put it right here, is Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency. So I'm going to start by talking about The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The other thing that you should know about Douglas Adams that I learned is that he is also a satirist, or satirist, however you would like to say it. You can kind of see a trend here that I like satire a lot. I like the humor in everyday things, and Douglas Adams did a really fantastic job with this. I understand now completely why these books are classics. The thing that kicks off our story is that seconds before the Earth is demolished to make way for an intergalactic freeway, Arthur Dent is whisked off of Earth by his friend Ford Prefect, who has secretly been an alien in disguise for the last 15 years, and he has been working on a revised edition of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Hence the name of the book. And together they end up going on this absurd journey through the galaxy that really I can't even begin to describe to you because it's just that insane. But I honestly thought that this was really fun. And the book also posed some really deep questions that I didn't expect it to, because again, I didn't know at the time that this was satire. But things that it made me think of were things like, you know, what sacrifices would we be willing to make if it meant that we could get the answers to the universe? And are those sacrifices worth the cost? Despite the story's seemingly incoherent nature, I can tell you that if you were to kind of zoom out and look at the story as a whole, every piece has its place. And that is one thing that I really appreciate about this story and about Douglas Adams in general. And also, I was really surprised. This book was written in 1979, and you would not know it, with the one exception that the main character is able to buy 6 pints of beer for £5. In this economy, that was the one giveaway. So that was really fun. The sequel is The Restaurant at the End of the World. And so I'm actually not going to give a synopsis for this because the real one's only like 3 sentences long anyway. It's just easier to talk about some of the questions that are posed in this book. So one of which was, if you're sitting at a restaurant and a cow were to walk up to you and it were to offer itself as your dinner that night, would you take the cow up on its offer? This really made me think because I do eat meat. Okay, I'm not vegetarian, and I know that the animals that we eat do not wish to be killed for our consumption, but there was something incredibly disturbing about this cow that was so excited to die in order to make these people's steak for their dinner. It really made me question my own humanity, because it's like, is that better? Is it better for the cow who wants to die and wants to be my meal to like present itself and say so that I could like live guilt-free for eating my meat? Or is it better to just not know? Then the other one is that are those who want to be in power the ones who are qualified to rule? Because in this story, we end up meeting the Emperor of the Universe, who is this gentle old man who lives in a cabin on a rainy planet in a place that almost no one knows about. He has no contact with the outside world, and he doesn't want to be the ruler of everything. And yet he seems like the kind of person that you would want to be the ruler, versus all of these people who are like constantly vying for power. And it really, I don't know, these books are messing with me in a very special way, and I'm actually really excited to pick up the next one. But the last statement in this that I really liked was that no matter how much time goes into you planning something, doesn't matter what it is, the universe can always throw a wrench in it. It can always mess with your plans. And so you kind of just have to make the best of every day and not take life too seriously, which as somebody with anxiety is very difficult to do sometimes. It's a really great reminder. And I don't know, I just think people can get a lot out of books like this. And then talking about Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency, I have to admit that originally when I read this story, I liked it even more than Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and The Restaurant at the End of the World, because this story is more of a closed loop. It loops back in on itself, and it felt more like a coherent narrative, even though it was still completely absurd. All of the tiny details from getting to A to Z can be really difficult to follow, but it always makes sense in the end. And so I'm sure if I were to go back and I were to reread this story, it would make even more sense the second time. A little bit about this story. So Dirk Gently is a detective that doesn't do things the conventional way. He's not interested in fingerprint powder. He's not interested in the normal way that police hunt for clues. He's more interested in things like telekinesis and time travel and quantum mechanics. That kind of sets the tone really for the whole story. His investigations tend to produce unorthodox and unexpected results. It's a part murder mystery, part sci-fi, part romance. It has it all. And all in complete absurdity. There are a lot of moving parts. So just know that. And I could see this novel irritating a lot of people. Either if you are not a fan of weird things or absurd things, or you take your murder mysteries very seriously, I honestly would be willing to bet if you read the synopsis of this book, you probably wouldn't have picked it up to begin with. So if you're like me and you read it and you went, oh, this is going to be a good weird time, you're probably going to really enjoy it as much as I did. It is a fever dream that is unapologetic about what it is. I like how the plot loops back in on itself. I would honestly recommend all of these books, and I recommend Douglas Adams. So this was my very first year that I ever read anything from him, so it was really cool to get to discover another new favorite author. And I decided to save the books that I was going to talk about the most for last, because these to me were the most impactful books that I read this whole year, and I have a lot to say, so I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. And the books I'm going to talk about right now are All the Light We Cannot See and Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr. And Anthony Doerr has cemented himself as one of my all-time favorite authors, and I will now pick up everything that he writes as soon as it comes out from now on, because I can't just not. Starting with All the Light We Cannot See, we have our character Marie-Laure, which I looked up the French pronunciation, and I was told in the video by the Frenchman that it was okay to pronounce this Mary-Laure in English. So that's probably what I'm going to go with, because I didn't think you want to hear me pretentiously try to pronounce French. Marie-Laure lives in Paris with her father, who works at the National History Museum. She's blind from the age of 6, and she faces very unique challenges during the Nazi occupation. Her and her father must flee to the city of St. Malo, where her great uncle lives. And with them, they are carrying a very prized possession, arguably the most prized possession in the National History Museum, and they're carrying it in secret. And then in a mining town in Germany, Werner Pfennig, who is a young boy, is growing up with his younger sister in this orphanage, and they're very poor, and they really don't have anything to entertain them or to tell them about the outside world. So one day they end up discovering this broken radio in this alleyway, and Werner takes it back and he is able to repair it, and all of a sudden they're able to hear music and stories and news coming from other places outside of the town where they're growing up. Werner is essentially a genius child, and he becomes such an expert in repairing radios that he ends up catching the eye of the Hitler Youth, and he ends up joining them, and that naturally has consequences for the rest of his life. This is a novel that is simultaneously beautiful and heartbreaking. And I've honestly never read from the perspective of a blind character before. She's depicted as being an incredibly capable and determined and intelligent young woman. She is not depicted at all as being like this feeble young girl that's just like terrified of everything. She is determined to live her life as normally as possible, even given the circumstances of the Nazi occupation. Her viewpoint is so vibrant and full of color, because she did used to be a sighted person before she was 6. When she meets people and she talks to them, she says that they kind of have this aura about them, that each person has their own unique color that kind of describes them and their personality. I just find that her perception of the world is really remarkable, and Doerr spends a lot of time talking about Braille books, which I had honestly not really ever spent any time thinking about before, but I was so enamored with the descriptions in the story and how much Braille books impacted her life and her ability to like experience stories the way that everyone else does, that I started researching Braille myself. I started looking up Braille books. I learned how cost prohibitive they are. I learned how to read uncontracted Braille. Contracted Braille is much harder. For those of you who've never tried, I probably would have to have a teacher in order to actually ever do that. But I did learn how to read the alphabet at the very least. It was just incredible, and I feel like I gained so much from this story and learning about the perspectives of other people. Werner was also unique because I've never read from the perspective of a Hitler Youth before. Werner, he's small for his age, and he's exceptionally bright, and at the core of his being, he is a kind and gentle boy, but he also recognizes that he's complicit in this system because he's not doing anything to fight back against it. He's a part of it as much as all of these other boys that are happy to hurt people, or they're really excited to even beat up on each other. He's not like that, but he is one of them. There will be moments when readers would probably find him downright unlikable. There are also moments in here that prove that there is good in him, there's good in everyone. And so the idea that, you know, people are either good or they're bad, there's a lot of gray in this book, and that could be good for people or that could be triggering for people. I'm not really sure. That would probably be dependent on you, but I thought that this story was really impactful, and Werner's friend Frederick is one of my favorite characters in this story. He is by far just like one of the best human beings that existed, you know, during this time in this story. So the way that this narrative is told is that the story jumps back and forth between the bombing of St. Malo, that is, you know, considered the present day, and the history of how Mary-Laure and Werner got to where they are. So, you know, starting with them as children and going up. I like the way that the time jumps are structured, though I will say that the very beginning of this book was a little difficult for me to get into because we're starting at the bombing of St. Malo and not at the beginning, so you're like pushed right in to the narrative, which honestly now, after I kept reading, I understood why Anthony Doerr made the decisions that he did, and I think that those choices were correct. It just took me a minute in order to actually get into the story. But once I was in, I was in. Like, that was it. I was locked into this story. And the chapters are all reasonably bite-sized chunks. Like, if you were to sit and you were to read this book by chapter and you just wanted to do that a little bit each day, you really could do that because you're not going to be spending too much time in one chapter. There are even some chapters that are only a page long. And yet, even the shortest chapters had purpose. There wasn't anything in this book I felt like was included just for fluff or for filler, which for a story that's 530 pages, I feel like that's a pretty incredible feat. And I think that the fact that he took time to make sure that everything that he wrote mattered is the reason why this book has so much feeling and has so much heart. I was left wanting to know what was going to happen next to these characters, and the way that they handle one of the worst times in history just makes me think that people were just built different back then. So both Werner and Mary-Laure were sympathetic and tragic in their own ways because both of their endings really surprised me. It was not at all what I was expecting. And though I do not intend to spoil anything for you, I can say that it left me grappling with a lot of different feelings. And I honestly would wholeheartedly recommend this book, and I hope that you will pick it up if you haven't already. And then I have Cloud Cuckoo Land, which is another story that I ended up picking up from the library, so I don't actually own a copy of this. But the threads between All the Light We Cannot See and Cloud Cuckoo Land are very similar in the beginning, and then they quickly diverge. We deal with more characters in this story. So we have Omer and Anna, who are in the 1400s Constantinople War between the Christians and the Ottomans. We have Zeno and Seymour, who are in modern day, where we get flashbacks to Zeno as a Vietnam POW. And then we have Constance, who is set very far in the future, and she's on this generational ship that is hurtling through space. With so many more perspectives, I will say that unlike in All the Light We Cannot See, We don't get as much time to spend with each character to like build that bond and connection with them, but Doerr handles the time that we have with them in a meaningful and purposeful way. We learn very quickly about each character, about their motivations, about their backgrounds, what their passions are, to the point where, to me, they felt like they were very tangible and very real. And there is a lot of pain and loss in this story for each of the characters. They all deal with their own struggles, but the one thing that they have in common is the narrative of Cloud Cuckoo Land, which each of them ends up discovering in their own way. And by discover, I mean literally the way in which they find the story, not even just how the story impacts them after they get to read it, because that's different for each person too. The overarching theme of this book is how easy it is for stories to be lost to time. So once there is only one copy left of a book, it essentially has to be protected at all costs, otherwise it just ceases to exist. It's this idea that books are immortal so long as there's someone to care for them. And the story Cloud Cuckoo Land, against all odds, has been carried throughout history by the people who were most impacted by it. And it's the reason that it has been able to survive for so many hundreds, if not thousands of years. There are, of course, some parts that have been irreparably damaged and they will never be recovered again, and in a way that makes the story more personal. One of the things I will mention is I talked about in All the Light We Cannot See that there was a blind character. I noticed in reading Cloud Cuckoo Land that Anthony Doerr does have a tendency to include characters who have a disability of some kind or some kind of disfigurement. And I am an able-bodied person, so I don't really have a right to talk about whether a book provides good representation or not. I can just say that from my perspective, it seems like he treats, blindness. And in this case, we have a character, Omeyer, who has a cleft palate. It seems like Anthony Doerr treats those characters with a lot of respect and a lot of sympathy, but I would be interested to hear from any of you or other people on the internet. Do they feel that these characters are good representatives of people who actually have those disabilities? One of the things that Omeyer ends up experiencing is that he is from the 1400s, where at the time of his birth, having a cleft palate was viewed as a literal curse. Like you would bring a curse upon your family if you were born. And so this village of people ends up hearing about his birth, and his father dies the same night that he's born, and his entire family, in order to protect him, they end up fleeing and going to go live in the woods. And they even make fun of him. His own family makes fun of him for the way that he looks, and despite everything, he ends up growing into this very gentle, emotionally intelligent young man who is a huge animal lover. I just wonder, is it considered patronizing or offensive for Doerr's characters to be viewed at in this light? I don't know, and I don't have a right to say, but I would definitely be interested to hear from any of you. I honestly think that his descriptive language and just everything that he writes, Anthony Doerr is an incredible author, and there are authors with way more experience who've written way more books than he has that I honestly think could learn a lot from just his depth of feeling that he's able to write with. It's a level that other authors should aspire to. And this novel is such a weird one to classify because each of the times that occurs in the story, so 1400s, we have modern day, and then we have the future. Each one has almost a completely different genre that it feels like it's a part of. So the past feels like it's historical fiction. Present day feels like contemporary fiction mixed with thriller, and the future feels like science fiction horror. And it's all just wrapped into one beautiful package that is Cloud Cuckoo Land. And at 622 pages, it is a package. I think it does take some patience to get through, especially if you're not somebody who likes one of those particular genres. Like maybe you really will like the contemporary stuff, but getting through historical fiction is just, that's a no for you. You may or may not end up liking this story. I loved it a whole lot because I love a lot of different genres of fiction. I thought it was really well written, and it's worth a read, and if nothing else, it's incredibly memorable. But that's all I have for you today. Those are my top reads of 2022. Thank you again for coming to hang out with me, and I really hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day or evening, and I'll see you next time.